tonight to introduce our guests. We certainly live in one of the most beautiful communities for plein air painting, and Patty takes great advantage of that. Before she gets started with her demonstration, I just want to tell you a little bit about her. She's a native Connecticut artist and writer who paints with oils and watercolors from life and often paints en plein at different locations throughout New England. Her work is modern, impressionist style, usually depicting country landscapes, seascapes, and still life. Patty instructs drawing and oil painting at Hamden and Wallingford Adult Education, also at the Guilford Art Center and Art Space, as well as providing private instruction. She loves to share her knowledge about art and guide her students as they develop their creations. During the COVID pandemic, Patty started writing a free weekly newsletter with articles on painting and drawing instruction and art history for more than 200 of her friends and former students as a way to inspire and communicate. Her articles can be found on her blog, Pen and Paint on Art and Writing. And is that address in the little package everybody got?
It's on the card. So if you want to pick up a card on the table, it has all my information on there.
Oh, great. And what can people sign up for the newsletter?
Sure. If they contact me, you're welcome to be on my newsletter. It's free. So sure.
That's great. All right. Thank you. Without further ado, Patty.
Thank you. So I've been painting for, I would say, about 20 years now, on and off. Mostly I like to go out and paint. I do some indoor painting, and of course I teach now too. But my favorite thing is to go out and paint. So I'm basically going to talk about my experiences as a plein air painter today and what it involves. This here is one of the paintings that I did do on site, and I'm going to talk about the method of how I went about doing this painting. Before I get started on it, though, I'll talk about my different items that I take with me. This here is, this thing is my cart that wore out so much I had to replace the fabric on it because I took it out so much. But it's a great way to carry things in and out of uncomfortable areas, rough terrain, and that sort of thing. And it has a seat on it where I put my items. I don't usually sit when I paint, I usually stand, but it's very convenient. This is called a Gorilla Box. That's the name of the company. And it's a nice little box. It has like it has its own easel type of setup. It has a palette that's built in that you can take out. It has a little storage area. It'll fit a 9x12 painting in here, and you can actually put small and bigger in there to secure pretty well. Actually, I didn't put the paint out in here because I thought it'd be kind of messy, but you can kind of see how I arrange my colors on the palette. And I always arrange them the same way. I don't change it. That way I know where everything is. Okay, so I'm going to kind of talk about how I go about painting and what it's all about. So my knowledge of painting took a huge leap forward when I started to take lessons and workshops from artists who paint and draw from life. I learned a great deal more about drawing, composition, value, edges, and light. I bought a cheap French easel at the time when I first started and began painting in my neighborhood, and took it with me on short trips. Eventually, the French easel became my Gorilla Box. To me, it's much more convenient. It's easier to carry around, and it's convenient. When you do plein air painting, you usually end up carrying a lot of stuff. So you try to, compact it down as much as possible because it does get heavy after you carry it around quite a bit. I also filled my bookshelves with books written by famous artists, and I studied their methods as well. And I went on the internet and studied their other artists and their work and how they did plein air painting. In between studying other artists, I painted as often as I could. The night before I went out, I would gather my canvas, easel, brushes, and paint together and set them by the door. The next day, I would get up early, usually on the weekend, because I worked during the week, and I'd be all ready to go. And by 9 a.m., I'd be at site and I'd be painting. I wanted to get in early before, I missed most of the morning light, and that was the way to prepare for it. My first few canvases were nothing impressive, but it didn't matter. I was hooked from the start. But I've got to tell you, I didn't start out that way. I did start out working from photos and working in a more realistic fashion. And after a while, I decided I didn't want to do that anymore. I wanted something a little bit more interesting, more impressionistic. And if I wanted something that was photorealistic to me, you just go and take a photo. I mean, it just didn't mean much to me anymore at that point. I wanted to do something more unique. So I learned how to do more impressionistic work through other artists and watched other people paint as well. Unlike working from a photo, when painting on plein air, it's called on plein air. It's a French word for working outside from life. The world around you caresses all your senses and sends you to a meditative state of mind. There's a sense of urgency to quickly capture the astounding array of color, light, and sound that nature presents like a buffet at a king's banquet. Painting in the country, you are enveloped with delicate sounds, with wild flora and musky aromas of the woods, the grassy fields, bubbling brooks, and the wildlife that live there. Once I saw a skinny silver fox tiptoe across the road, not 50 feet in front of me. In the city, there's the buzz of the bus and car engines, the clanging of the train, the bustle of people going and off to do their errands, and the aroma of freshly made coffee and donuts that seep into the sidewalk. So you get all the senses no matter where you go. You can't experience these sensations when painting from a photograph. Sitting indoors at an easel, you don't feel the warm sun on your skin, the smell and scent of honeysuckle floating in the breeze, or hear the birds singing in the trees. It's more than just putting paint on canvas, it's a whole experience. Okay, so now I'm going to kind of talk about this picture. This is a scene from the Farm River. I live in Northford, and I live very close to the Farm River. It's just down the street from me. And there's lots of great places that you can go and set up on the Farm River to paint. And so that's what I did one summer day. The Farm River begins from a small brook flowing off the Pistapog Pond, which is partially within the towns of Wallingford, Durham, and North Branford. From there, it flows southward 16 miles and empties into Long Island Sound. So near the shoreline, the fresh water mixes with seawater and becomes an estuary. The area I chose to paint is surrounded by open fields owned by our town. Trees and wild undergrowth line the river on both sides. The river draws wildlife, including deer, rabbits, turtles, and coyotes. I had spotted this place on one of my hikes and knew it would be a great place to paint, especially before the whole vegetation filled in. It was basically right about this time of the year in early spring. Things were just starting to bud out. There was a nice downriver view of the water, new growth, fallen trees, light rapids, and nice contrasts of light and dark values. Looking in this direction, I decided where my focus was going to be, which is very important when you, especially when you go out and paint. You have to find a focal point because there's so much around you. There's so many things to look at, and there's no way you're going to get it all in. So you figure out what your focal point is, and then you work it from there. Okay. Before I begin, I grab my digital camera and take several photos. The photos become not a crutch, but more of a checkpoint, just in case I'm unable to complete the painting on that day. I find that as I do more plein air painting, the less I refer to the photos and more I trust my memory. Okay, so I show a picture of my setup in your handout, and I talked about the Gorilla box. I do use a camera tripod, a very heavy one. And one of the reasons why I use a really heavy one is sometimes it's really windy out, and the wind will take a setup in a New York minute if it's too light. So I've got this really heavy tripod, and even though it's a pain to carry around, sometimes it's really solid, and it works really well for me. And I also started out with a 9x12 size. I wanted to keep it small, but I always start with a drawing before I even start painting anything. So I'm going to show you the book that I carry with me to draw with. I usually carry this type of size drawing book, and I make little drawings of whatever I'm going to paint. They don't have to be perfect. They just have to give me a pretty good idea of where the darks and lights are and where everything is. And then if I decide I don't like the way I have it organized, I can redraw it until I'm ready and I know that I like how it's set up and how it's composed. So I'm going to pass this around so you can all kind of look at it. You're welcome to look through it. I use either pencil or charcoal when I do that.
Do you indicate where the darks are at that moment?
I try to.
And that's so hard.
Yeah, I try to do that in the drawing whenever I can. Sometimes I go a little faster and I don't cover it all, but I do try to show where the darks and the lights are in there. But a lot of it has to do with composition. Yeah. If I don't like, if I look at something and I think this looks okay, and then I start to draw it and I decide, oh, it's not quite right, then I can redo it then instead of having to redo it in the painting and a mess doing it that way. So it's better to be prepared and have it all ready before you actually start painting. So my palette, I try not to bring too much paint with me when I go out to paint, but I do have a certain palette. I use titanium white, cadmium yellow, orange, and red, alizarin crimson, transparent oxide red and brown, permanent green, viridian, cerulean, cobalt blue, and ultramarine blue. And sometimes I vary it. I don't use all those colors, but I use some of the main colors pretty often. I usually set up my colors the night before or that morning. I don't like to have to do that while I'm out there and spending time on site. So if I can have them all set up already, and I might bring some extra white with me just in case, that works for me. I also use what's called mineral spirits. That's what is in this container here. It's odorless mineral spirits by Gamsol. It doesn't have an odor. It is a little dangerous if you don't want to breathe it just because it's odorless. You don't want to breathe it, but it's mainly for thinning out paint and also for cleaning your brushes. Before I really get started doing a painting, I'll prepare the canvas sort of like this one is prepared with a color. It varies depending on what I'm painting, what's going to go on it, but it's just a thin layer, like really thinned out paint. And I just kind of wipe it on there and let it dry. It takes maybe 10 minutes to dry. So I can get this ready and then do my drawing and then go back to it and I'm ready to put it on the canvas. I also wanted to show you, I do carry a color wheel with me. I made this the other night, so it's still a little wet. But color wheels are great as reference to help you decide how to mix colors. The hardest part about oil painting is learning how to mix colors, learning how to get the color that you want. So if you have, say, like a yellow in a bush or something, but it's not a bright yellow that comes out of your tube, that means you have to dull it down or mix something with it to make it just right. Oftentimes, if you mix the opposite color on the color wheel, that'll help change the color to what you want, more a natural color. But you do need to know how to mix those colors together to get the color you want. I use a lot of pure colors to mix with. I do not go and buy a color for every color there is on the rainbow. I try to mix my own colors whenever possible. It's good practice. There's no way you can carry that many paints with you. It's too tedious, and you really do need to learn. That's part of the whole process, is learning how to mix colors. And it takes a lot of time, a lot of experience. It's not something you learn overnight. Okay. I did talk a little bit about liquid gel, which is a drier gel. It's you can mix it with your paint, and it kind of helps it flow really good on your canvas. I don't use it as much anymore as I used to, but you can use it, and it'll help your paint dry, your painting dry faster later on, and it'll also help to move the paint around on the canvas for you. So there's lots of things you can add to paint and lots of things you can paint with. And it's just good to me, I just tell my students, experiment, try different things to see what you like. That's the best way to do it. Okay, so I also kind of included in this a list of things to carry with you, to bring with you. This is a good kind of overall list. You don't have to bring everything, but like, just make sure you have your phone, your backpack, your solvent, a viewfinder is basically, it's something to help you figure out what your composition is. Nylon gloves. I use nylon gloves. I can't stand getting paint all over my hands, and I end up getting paint on everything else too. So I always use nylon gloves when I paint. Pencil, vine charcoal. And I'll explain a little bit more about using the vine charcoal later. Now I use panels or canvas. This is a canvas right here, but I also, this here is a panel, and that one there is a panel. And they're nice. They're really nice because they're easy to carry around, and you can't poke a hole in them so easy like you can with canvas. They're much easier to carry. They can be heavy once they get big, but for small paintings, they're really nice. And they work really well. Some of them are canvas covered and some of them are more smooth. You can get different textures on them as well as canvas. So that's another thing that you kind of experiment with it, see which you like the best. Okay. So, okay, always carry out what you carry in. So always bring trash bag, water, insect repellent, very important. There are definitely mosquitoes and other insects out there that'll drive you crazy. Sometimes they get in the paint, you know, they get on the painting. I just paint over, you know. It's like, might as well just add a little bit of, you know, texture in there. So, okay, poncho. Oh, a hat. When you go out in the summertime especially, but even, you know, even when it's not hot, it's a good idea to have a hat. I love my Filson hat. This is waterproof. It's great to keep the sun off your eyes, and it gives a little shade for your eyes when you're painting. You don't really want that sun right there, and it'll preserve your hair and your head, and you know, keep you cool. So very much important to have the right clothing. Going out in the winter, which I have, you definitely want to make sure you have the right clothing. Lots of layers. I actually have a pair of blizzard boots, they're called. They're very thick-soled, heavy-duty boots for winter. And when you're out there and you're painting for 3 or 4 hours, you're really happy to have something that comfortable and that dry, especially for your feet. Your feet feel it and your hands feel it when you're out in the cold. So, it doesn't affect the paint, no. In fact, the paint loves the cold. Paint does not bother with the cold. A little bit more with the heat, but not, as long as you don't have the sun on it, you're okay in the summer with paint. But no, it doesn't hurt. It doesn't hurt the paint. It just hurts you more than it hurts the paint. It really, especially your hands. I haven't found a really good way to protect, you know, keep my hands warm, because I have to wear those gloves, and I try to like wear a couple of sets of gloves sometimes, but it doesn't always work real well. So, but definitely layers and hats and, you know, all that in the winter, and cool clothes. Yep. Yeah, I do set up in the shade whenever possible. You don't want the sun on your painting. You don't want the sun on you, obviously, but the sun will definitely throw your eyes off. So you know, you won't get a good view of what you're painting with the sun on you and on your palette. But sometimes you have to. Sometimes there's no choice. I've tried using umbrellas. The wind will take them. It drives me crazy. So the best thing to do is in the summer, try to get away from the sun, not have the sun come straight on you if you can possibly do that, or try to adjust to it as best you can, or find a shady spot, which is the best thing, really. Okay, so the first thing I do after I, you know, coat my canvas, I do the quick drawing, which I showed you the book. When you're painting outdoors, when you're painting indoors, you're painting from a photo, you're painting a certain thing. You know what you're painting, you know how to crop it, you know how to compose it. When you're painting outdoors, there's this whole world out there. How do you make it smaller? How do you fit it on your canvas? How do you figure that out? Well, you just You have to figure out your focus point, your focal point. Once you get that, you have to figure out where your eye is going. Is it going into that focal point or is it going away? Just make sure that your eye goes into that focal point. And the other thing is you don't have to put everything there. You're the artist. That's the difference between a photographer and an artist. A photographer is going to catch everything. The artist doesn't have to. You don't have to put in the whole forest of trees. You can just put in a few here or there. You can pick out the ones you want. You can move them. You can move things around. Just have to be careful and know what you're doing when you're moving them, but you can move things around. But be aware of where your focal point is at all time when you're doing it. Okay. So I'll show you a couple of things. This top one, I think it might be in your handout, but I'm not sure. But this top one is the drawing that I did, that I started out with. Basically wanted to figure out where all the logs and the trees were going and which direction the water was going. Okay. The bottom picture, I use a measuring device at all times when I paint. And one of my teachers years ago got me to use a chopstick. And what I did was you measure down a 1/4 inch. I guess every inch it is, I put a different color. So there's several different colors on this thing. So there's like 6 or 7 inches, but there's a notch for each 1/4 inch. So I use that to measure, and I'll go and I'll look at the item and I'll put my finger where the bottom is. I'll put the top where the top of this is. And that's how I measure how large something is. And I start with that wherever I want to start on the painting, but I always use this to measure either up or across. And that's how I keep everything in proportion to each other. Okay, measuring, I tell my students all the time, you have to keep measuring. You can't just throw lines on there and figure out where it goes later. The best way to do it is to measure from the start. Until you have a really good eye and know you can do it without measuring, the best thing to do is have some kind of device, whether it's a pencil, a chopstick, or something, so that you can figure out the proportions and how everything relates to one another. Okay. So this is a fun device that I use a lot. Okay, so the next thing I do, once the canvas is dry like this, and I have my drawing all set, then what I do is I take fine charcoal. I tell my students, do not use pencil, never use any kind of pencil type of device, always use something soft like charcoal, and then draw the same item on your canvas that you drew in your picture, in your drawing, and put it on with the charcoal, and put it, you don't have to put every detail, but you get the basic shapes in there. You know, you need to know where they are in relation to one another on your canvas. And once you get that, then you use paint to outline all those lines where the charcoal was. The paint, when you put the paint down, and it's a thinned out paint, it could be like an ochre color or a brown color. You go over the charcoal and the paint will pick up the charcoal. It won't let it stay there. So it's really nice because you don't have to worry about the charcoal coming through later when you're painting, you know, when you're getting done with your painting. It won't be there anymore. Okay. Whether with pencil, sometimes, especially in the light areas, it'll come through the paint. You really don't want that. It'll ruin your painting. So I do an outline. And then I start blocking in color. I start with the darkest darks. And I do large areas. I don't do detail. There's no details, just large areas of color until I cover the whole canvas with some kind of color. And I go from dark to light. I try not to use white until later on. Always leave the white out until much later in the painting process.
You say leave the white out, the white you might be using for directly, or the white in the paint.
White in the paint, white directly, any kind of white paint at all. Try not to use it right away. Try to let it go for a while and do everything else, and then come in with your white mixtures, because you're going to have to mix white to do your sky, you know. But try not to do it right away. Try to work with your darks first. They'll dry the fastest, and it'll be easier for you to work with other paint. If you put the white in the early stages, then you're going to have problems. Everything's going to start smearing and turn into like a gray mess later on. So I try to wait on white mixes. So, I talked about the block in. So I had, on this painting, I had some really nice movement with the water. The water was really rough over here. There were some nice white caps here, but then it kind of disappeared back into the distance, which is really nice. So when I was putting in more detail and more color and more, you know, darks, this is where all the edges, the really sharp edges would be, is up close. If you think about your vision, when you're looking something in the distance, it's not near as clear as something very close to you is. And so that's what you want to do when you're painting. These trees back here, you know they're trees, but they're very soft and very light. So the color, especially in landscapes, the further back you go, you'll lose yellow first in your paint mixtures. Then you'll lose red. And eventually, if you keep going way far back, things like mountains and trees and everything will turn kind of a blue or a purple color, because you lose those colors because of the atmosphere in between you and them. Okay, it's always there. So that is another reason why something like this painting, this is all sharp here and your eye goes here. It doesn't settle on anything back here, just that you know that there's something back there. This is where your eye settles, and that's what you want. You want your eye to be right there.
And that would be called your focus point.
Right, my focal point right through here. And you want your eye to move through it, but you also want to see the textures and the sharpness right through here.
So you mentioned white being like tricky to work with. Is there any other color that you worked with outside that you found hard to mix and get the right color?
Not really. It's mixing the colors is something you just kind of, you learn through experience. Whether it's a white base or not, doesn't matter. But I've learned, like using the color wheel, that if you use the opposite color, that really helps give you a more natural shade of color than what comes right out of the tube. Okay. There's a lot of red in landscaping, even though you don't realize it. There's a lot of red out there. So if you mix the opposite, you mix green with the opposite on the wheel is red. So it makes sense to put a tiny bit of red in there. But you also have a lot of blues and other colors in there too. So you just gotta figure out. What I do is I'll hold the paintbrush up, I'll mix it, or the palette knife. I'll hold it up and I'll look and see, does that look like that color? Is it too dark? Is it too light? You know, and I compare as much as I can by looking. Also, the values of things will look different next to each other. So once you get a really nice dark value here, this will brighten up this area. This that's really light will brighten up, and so forth. So you have to look at what's next to your items. Okay. I did, there are some things that I removed from the scene. I removed one of the dead limbs. I didn't put it in. I wanted the eye to not be obstructed when it went through the picture. So there was something that did come correct right across here, so I took it out and I rearranged that part. Like I said, you're the artist, you can do whatever you want. So. Okay, and I did kind of talk about aerial perspective when I was talking about colors and how things change as they go in the distance. So aerial perspective is the atmospheric distance between objects in a painting. The presence in the atmosphere of moisture and tiny particles of dust and similar material causes a scattering of light as it passes through them. The degree of scattering being dependent on the wavelength, which corresponds to the color of the light. Because light of short wavelength, blue light, is scattered the most, the colors of all distant dark objects tend toward blue. For example, distant mountains have a bluish cast, and yellow disappears, like I said earlier, as it recedes, followed by red. The heavier the atmosphere, the more pronounced the effect. It is most apparent in lower elevations that commonly have higher amounts of moisture in the air. There are value changes as well. All things become cooler in color except white and lighter as they recede into the distance, and their edges soften so that all these trees back here, there's no sharp edges back here. All the sharp edges are in here, but this is all softened color. Okay, so you probably want to wonder how long I spend outside doing this at any time. Usually I spend between 2.5 and 3 hours doing a painting out on site. That's really pushing it. 3 hours is kind of pushing it because your light changes, especially when it's full sun. Not as much when it's a cloudy day. You have more even light then, but I like to paint when there's lots of sun. Even though I'm in the shade, the sun comes down and really brightens areas, and I really like that. I like the light. So, okay. Oh, another thing too is when you're painting outside, and I like to stand, not everybody does, some people like to sit, but I think it's better if you can stand and paint because you really need to get back. You need to, make a few changes on your painting and then stand back and look at it. Because if you're up too close, you're not really getting a good view of what you're painting. You need to stand back and see how it all relates and then make changes. So I do that every few minutes. I'll stand back, I'll put everything down and I'll stand back and look at it and see how the colors and everything relates and how the drawing looks. If the drawing's off, you have to, fix it. So this painting here, by the way, is one I did at Manassas. My former students. And didn't finish it. It's not finished. I got most of it on there, but I still want to do more detail work on it. So someday I'll get to it. But it was a fun day out. The water was beautiful. There's a lot of really nice colors in the marsh and wonderful greenery in the distance. So it made a really nice.
This is if you're doing the work, the tide would be a
Yeah,
consideration.
it could, yeah, definitely. Oh, and also the time of day. I mean, well, in the morning, obviously, the sun is it's gonna rise. So your shadows are gonna change. So that's why you don't want to spend more than 2.5 to 3 hours on a painting when you got a lot of sun and shadows and stuff you're working with. Because then you're gonna be redoing and redoing and redoing. You don't want to do that. You could go back the next day if it's the same sunny type of, or same condition, and work on it some more. And I've done that. But most people like to just get it all in one sitting, and I kind of do too. I will take it home and work on it at home a little bit, but I try to get as much as I can done while I'm there. At least get the colors in correctly and the drawing in correctly, if nothing else. And then I'll take the photos that I've taken of it and go back and see if I've missed any detail that I'd like to put back in. But I don't use photos for color reference because it's usually totally off. I've never been able to get a good photo as good and get as much depth as you can when you're in person and seeing the colors. And that's the thing. I mean, cameras are wonderful things. They're great for references and stuff like that. But in real life, you just get a lot more values, a lot more color depth. The colors are more, much stronger, much better. So that's another reason why I work from life. Because to me, it's just more genuine. It's more real. And it's hard at first, obviously, because you gotta get those colors mixed just right and do it quickly. But after you do it enough times, it gets a lot easier and you can do it. As the paint appears on the canvas, my sense of time and place temporarily disappears. I become part of the painting, as if I were moving inside it in between brushstrokes. Before I know it, 2, then 3 hours have passed. The light is moving all the while across and around my subject, but now it is really shifting away from my original vision. And my legs get tired, my back is sore, but my soul is nourished, okay? At this point, I reluctantly begin to step out of the painting and back to the present. So I think I talked about that. So this painting I did finish in the studio, but I got most of it done on site. So I feel pretty good about it. Sometimes they just don't work out. You can't beat yourself up about it. If you don't have a good day, you don't have a good day. It just doesn't come out. So you just put it aside and do another one. Go out and do it again. You can do the same one over and over. And keep working on it and learn. You always learn something. I already talked about clothing, so I'm not going to go through that too much, other than, just make sure I have a list of things in here that you should bring with you, as far as clothing. And it's just always good to be well prepared when it comes to that. One other thing is, what type of brush do you use? There's so many brushes out there. Do you buy expensive brushes? Do you buy cheap brushes? Well, you can buy expensive brushes if you have lots of money. I don't. So I kind of go on the in-between. I try to buy a brush that is pretty decent, and I've tried different kinds. I tend to like, this one here is really good. It's silver ruby something. And I don't know the name of the brand, but I get it at Jerry's Artarama, and they're really good brushes. But it doesn't matter how expensive or how cheap they are, they don't last. I mean, you can clean them, you got to clean them and keep them clean after each time that you use them, but they wear down no matter what you do. So, you know, it doesn't matter if they're expensive or not, they're going to wear down. And I have a lot of them, like this one here has this little dent in the top. They get kind of fuzzy. When they get fuzzy, they're not really good. So
You only bring 3 brushes.
no, I'll bring, it depends. Like something small like that, you don't need a lot of big brushes. So I might bring 4 or 5 brushes or something. Depends on if, you know, how I feel about cleaning them in between, because you don't have a lot of time. So I don't like to clean brushes in between what I'm doing. I like to have something, you know, if I have to change into a blue from a brown, I'll clean the brush. So I'll pick another brush up. But it's good to keep your brushes clean. You know, don't let them sit in your Gamsol or whatever for too long. Clean them as good as you can, and they'll last a little while, at least a few months. I use bristle brushes, which are these really harder, you know, harder brushes, and I also use a synthetic brush, which is this type. I don't buy the expensive, you know, fur brushes. It's just not worth it to me. They're too expensive. But these work really good, and I have my favorite brushes. Once you work it a little while, you find the ones that work for you the best, and that's what you use. But I go through brushes. You know, you can't help it. You have to clean them, and when you clean them or you use them, you're pushing the paint in. I mean, you're destroying the bristle. Yeah, so.
Are there any restrictions on how to get rid of your Gamsol or anything like that?
Oh, yeah. So with Gamsol, of course, you're using oil paint, so it's oil-based. So Gamsol is, it's not a water-based type of cleaner, okay? So you don't want to pour it down the drain. So what you do is like what I do is I'll take this container home and I'll let it sit for 2 or 3 days. Don't move it, don't shake it, nothing. And then what happens is your paint will fall to the bottom, and the cleaner paint will be at the top. You pour it off into another container, you clean your container, and you can reuse it again. You go back and forth between 2 or 3 containers. You don't throw any of the Gamsol away. You just throw your paper towels away in the trash. I always use paper towels. So, but never throw it down the sink or anything. It's very bad. Any questions about anything? No? Yes. Eventually you're gonna have to, like when you do the sky, you're gonna need some white in that, but try to put it off as long as you can. You know, eventually you will, but try to get your darks in first. Any other questions? No? Okay, I don't think I have anything else to talk about. I mean, I talked about my setup. Yep, that's it. That's it. Cookies and water over there and some cards if you want to look at my website. Also, I have 33 paintings up on the rotunda. So if you want to go up there and look at the paintings that I have on display, a lot of them were done on plein air. Not all of them, but a lot of them were.
Are they gonna be there a while?
They're going to be there for the whole month of April. Yeah. Well, she talked about it, but yeah, I do teach classes at Guilford Arts Center, Arts Place in Cheshire. I do some adult ed classes as well. You can go on my website and check out what I do. And if you want, if you want to be on my newsletter, you're welcome to give me your email and I'll be glad to add you to my. All right, thank you for coming.
I'm present with one of her